The silence in the boardroom of Ascend Airways was so heavy it felt like it could crush bone. Captain Brad Halloway, a man who had flown through hurricanes and combat zones without sweating, was now trembling. His eyes were fixed on the person at the head of the table. He didn't see the woman in the grey hoodie he had humiliated at Gate 42 yesterday. He didn't see the passenger he had threatened to arrest for looking suspicious in first class. He saw Dr. Vivian Toussaint, the newly appointed CEO of the very airline he worked for. She slowly slid a crumpled boarding pass across the mahogany table, the same pass he had torn in half. "You said I didn't fit the profile, Captain," she said, her voice terrifyingly calm. "Let's see if you fit mine." The digital clock above the check-in counters at Chicago O'Hare International Airport read 05:45 a.m. It was a Tuesday, typically a lull in the chaotic rhythm of air travel, but a heavy blizzard rolling in off Lake Michigan had snarled the schedule. Delays were bleeding into cancellations, and the terminal hummed with the low-frequency anxiety of stranded travelers. Dr. Vivian Toussaint stood near a pillar, her hands buried deep in the pockets of an oversized charcoal-grey university hoodie. To the casual observer, she looked like a tired graduate student, or perhaps a mother traveling home after a long weekend. She wore no makeup, her hair was pulled back in a simple, slightly messy bun, and her feet were clad in comfortable, worn-out sneakers. Nobody looked at her twice. In the hierarchy of the airport, she was invisible. That was exactly how she wanted it. 48 hours ago, the board of directors for Ascend Airways, a legacy carrier struggling with plummeting stock prices and a reputation for terrible customer service, had voted unanimously to appoint her as the new chief executive officer. The press release was scheduled for tomorrow morning. The headshots, the interviews, the fanfare, it was all waiting in New York. But Vivian, a logistics genius who had pulled 3 Fortune 500 companies back from the brink of bankruptcy, didn't believe in boardroom reports. She believed in data gathered from the ground. She wanted to know why Ascend was failing, and she knew she wouldn't get the truth if she walked in wearing a $3,000 suit surrounded by handlers. She had booked a first-class ticket on Ascend Flight 909 from Chicago to New York under her maiden name, Vivian Coate. She wanted to experience the premium service the airline boasted about in its commercials. "Excuse me," a man in a business suit grunted, shouldering past her as he rushed toward the kiosk, clipping her shoulder. He didn't apologize. Vivian merely adjusted her stance, her dark eyes scanning the area. She pulled a small, battered notebook from her pocket. She noted the length of the lines, 40 minutes for economy check-in, the number of unmanned counters, 4, and the demeanor of the staff, frazzled and defensive. She moved toward the security checkpoint, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had spent half her life in transit. Once through the TSA gauntlet, she made her way to the gate. Gate K-12 was a scene of controlled chaos. The blizzard outside was whipping snow against the floor-to-ceiling windows, obscuring the view of the Boeing 777 that waited at the jet bridge. Vivian sat 3 rows back from the podium, observing. The gate agent, a young woman with a name tag reading Jessica, looked like she was on the verge of tears. She was typing furiously, fielding questions from angry passengers and trying to announce boarding groups over a faulty PA system. Standing behind Jessica, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, was the pilot. Captain Brad Halloway was the poster child for aviation authority. He was tall, with a jawline that could cut glass and silver-streaked hair that suggested wisdom and experience. His uniform was immaculate, the 4 gold stripes on his epaulets gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He held a coffee cup in one hand and was laughing at something, completely ignoring the chaos the gate agent was drowning in. Vivian frowned. A leader supports the team. If the ground crew is overwhelmed, the flight crew should be stepping up. not leaning back. She made a note in her book. Pilot. Disengaged. Dismissive of ground ops. The boarding announcement finally crackled to life. We are now inviting our first-class passengers and Diamond status members to board Flight 909 to New York. Vivian stood up. She picked up her modest duffel bag and joined the short queue forming at the priority lane. There were 3 men ahead of her, all white, all wearing suits. Captain Halloway offered them a crisp nod as they passed, flashing a practiced, charming smile. "Good morning, sir. Welcome aboard," Halloway said to the man directly in front of Vivian. The man passed. Vivian stepped forward. She held out her boarding pass to Jessica. Before the scanner could beep, a large hand clamped down on the counter, covering the scanner. Vivian looked up. Captain Halloway had moved. He wasn't smiling anymore. His eyes, an icy blue, raked over her hoodie, her sneakers, and her face with a look of sneering skepticism. "Hold on, Jessica," Halloway said, his voice deep and commanding. He didn't look at the agent. He kept his eyes locked on Vivian. "You're in the wrong line, sweetheart. Economy boarding is Group 5. We haven't called it yet." The air between them seemed to drop 10 degrees. Vivian didn't flinch. She had faced down union leaders, hostile shareholders, and Senate subcommittees. A pilot with a superiority complex was not going to rattle her. "I am in the correct line," Vivian said softly. Her voice was calm, possessed of a quiet dignity that usually made people listen. "I have a first-class ticket." She tried to move her hand to scan the digital code on her phone again, but Halloway didn't move his hand. He leaned over the podium, looming over her. "Let me see that," he demanded, not asking. Vivian turned her phone screen toward him. "Seat 2A. Vivian Coate." Halloway squinted at the screen, then let out a sharp, derisive breath through his nose. He looked at Jessica. "Check it in the system, manually." "Captain, the scanner is working fine," Jessica stammered, looking terrified of him. "Check it," Halloway snapped. "We've had a lot of glitches lately with upgrade fraud. People buying stolen points online." He turned back to Vivian, a smirk playing on his lips. "It happens all the time. Folks trying to sneak up front where they don't belong." Vivian felt the heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from anger. She knew the statistics. Upgrade fraud was less than 0.01% of issues. This wasn't about fraud. "I purchased this ticket with my credit card, Captain," Vivian said, her tone hardening slightly. 2 weeks ago. Full fare." "Full fare?" Halloway laughed. It was a loud, barking sound that drew the attention of the passengers waiting in the nearby seats. "For a flight to New York? That's a $2,000 ticket. And you're telling me you just bought it?" He gestured vaguely at her outfit. "You don't look like our typical full-fare first-class passenger. No luggage, no suit. Just this. Is there a dress code for first class that is not listed on the website?" Vivian asked. "Because if there is, I missed it. I assumed my money was as green as the gentleman's before me." Halloway's eyes narrowed. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by a woman. Especially not by a black woman in a hoodie. "It's called discretion, ma'am," Halloway said, lowering his voice to a menacing rumble. "As the captain, I have the final say on who boards my aircraft. If I suspect a security issue or fraudulent activity, you don't fly. Simple as that." "Jessica," Vivian said, bypassing the pilot and looking at the agent. "Is the ticket valid?" Jessica was typing furiously, her face pale. She looked at the screen, then at the captain, then at Vivian. "Yes, it shows valid. Seat 2A. Paid in full." Vivian looked back at Halloway. "There, valid. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to board." She reached for the scanner again. Halloway snatched the paper boarding pass from the counter. Jessica had printed a backup just in case and held it out of reach. "Computer glitches happen," Holloway said. "I'm not buying it. We need to verify the payment method. You got the credit card you used." "This is harassment," Vivian said. "You did not ask the 3 men before me for their credit cards. You are profiling me." "I am ensuring the safety and integrity of this flight," Holloway shouted. The pretense of politeness was gone. He wanted to humiliate her. He wanted her to back down, to apologize, to shuffle away to the back of the line. "I don't like your attitude. You're being aggressive." The crowd was watching now. Phones were being raised, recording. Vivian saw the phones. She knew that if she caused a scene, if she raised her voice, the narrative would shift. Unruly passenger removed. She needed to be smarter. She needed to let him dig his own grave. "I'm standing perfectly still, Captain," Vivian said. "I have raised neither my voice nor my hand. You are the one shouting." Holloway's face turned a mottled red. He realized he was losing control of the optic, but his pride wouldn't let him retreat. "Jessica, remove her from the manifest," Holloway ordered. "Captain?" Jessica squeaked. "You heard me. Denied boarding. Reason? Failure to comply with crew instructions and aggressive behavior. Rebook her on the later flight. In economy. If she wants to fly, she flies in the back where we can keep an eye on her." Vivian's knuckles turned white as she gripped her phone. This was illegal. This was a violation of at least 3 federal aviation regulations and a dozen internal company policies. "You are making a mistake, Captain Holloway," Vivian said. "A very expensive mistake." Holloway leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and mints. "The only mistake I made was thinking you could afford to be here. Get out of my line." He turned his back on her, dismissing her like she was nothing. Vivian looked at Jessica. The young agent mouthed, "I'm so sorry," but she typed the command. The printer whirred. A new boarding pass slid out. Seat 34E, middle seat, last row, economy. Vivian took the pass. She didn't scream. She didn't call the police. She didn't pull out her badge, which was currently tucked in the inner pocket of her duffel bag. She looked at the back of Captain Holloway's head. "Enjoy your command while it lasts, Captain," she thought. "Thank you, Jessica," Vivian said. She took the economy ticket and walked away from the first-class lane, sitting down on the hard plastic chairs of the waiting area. She pulled out her phone and sent a single text message to a private number. "Review the flight manifest for Ascend 909. Do not intervene yet. Record everything. V." The flight was delayed another 45 minutes, while Holloway double-checked the manifest, a petty power move to show everyone who was in charge. When boarding finally resumed, Vivian boarded with Group 5. She walked past the first-class cabin. Seat 2A was empty. She caught Holloway's eye as she passed the cockpit door. He was standing there, greeting passengers. When he saw her, he gave a smug, triumphant smile. He winked. Vivian didn't smile back. She kept walking, down the long aisle, past the Economy Plus section, past the exit rows, all the way to the very back of the plane. Seat 34E was a nightmare. To her left was a man who was already asleep and snoring, his elbow encroaching into her space. To her right was a teenage boy listening to music so loud she could hear the lyrics through his headphones. The seat did not recline. The wall behind her was the lavatory, and the smell of chemical disinfectant was already strong. Vivian stowed her bag and sat down. She buckled her belt. This was the product Ascend Airways was selling to 80% of its customers. It was cramped, dirty, and demoralizing. Transformation requires pain, she reminded herself. Now I know exactly how much pain. The plane finally pushed back from the gate. The safety demonstration played on the overhead screens that were flickering and yellowed with age. "Ladies and gentlemen, "This is Captain Halloway from the flight deck." The voice boomed over the PA system. "We apologize for the delay. We had some administrative issues to sort out at the gate to ensure the quality of your flight. We're looking at a flight time of 2 hours and 10 minutes. Flight attendants, prepare for departure." As the plane taxied to the de-icing pad, Vivian observed the flight attendants. They looked exhausted. A male flight attendant, Tom, was working the back galley. He was older, with kind eyes, but he moved with a limp. As he checked the overhead bins, he noticed Vivian. "Rough seat," he said sympathetically. "Sorry about the mix-up at the gate. I heard what happened." "News travels fast," Vivian noted. "Captain Halloway. He's particular," Tom said, keeping his voice low. "He calls it keeping standards. We call it something else, but not while the mic is on." "Does he do this often?" Vivian asked. Tom hesitated. He looked around to make sure the purser wasn't watching. "Let's just say you're not the first person who didn't fit the look to get bumped. Last month it was an Indian tech CEO. Halloway claimed his visa looked fake. It wasn't." Vivian nodded slowly. "And management does nothing?" "Management?" Tom scoffed softly. "Management is invisible. They just cut costs and tell us to smile more. The pilots' union is strong, and Halloway is the union rep for this hub. He's untouchable, or he thinks he is." "Untouchable," Vivian repeated. "We'll see." The plane rumbled down the runway and lifted into the grey, snowy sky. For the first hour, the flight was uneventful. But as they began their descent toward the east coast, the turbulence hit. It wasn't just bumps, it was structural shaking. The fasten seatbelt sign dinged on. Suddenly, a commotion erupted 3 rows ahead of Vivian. "My chest! I can't breathe!" A woman in the aisle seat was clutching her chest, gasping for air. Her face was turning a terrifying shade of grey. "Help! Someone help her!" her neighbour screamed. Tom, the flight attendant, rushed over. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" "Heart!" The woman gasped. "Condition! Is there a doctor on board?" Tom shouted, looking around frantically. He hit the call button to the cockpit. "Captain, we have a medical emergency. Possible cardiac arrest. Row 31. The intercom crackled. Halloway's voice was annoyed. "We are beginning our descent, Tom. Make sure they are seated. Is it a panic attack?" "No, sir, she's grey. We need a doctor." "Fine," Halloway sighed over the PA. "Ladies and gentlemen, if there is a licensed medical professional on board, please identify yourself to the crew." 2 rows up, a young man raised his hand. "I'm a chiropractor." "No, we need a standard doctor," Tom yelled. Vivian unbuckled her seatbelt. Technically, she was a doctor of economics and logistics. She wasn't a connection to medical aid, but she knew CPR, and more importantly, she knew how to manage a crisis. But before she could move, she saw the woman slump over. "She's out! No pulse!" Tom yelled. "I need the AED!" The plane pitched violently as they hit an air pocket. Tom was thrown against the seats, losing his footing. Vivian stood up. She planted her feet wide to brace against the turbulence. She moved into the aisle, grabbing the AED, automated external defibrillator, kit from the wall mount that Tom couldn't reach. "Get her flat," Vivian commanded. Her voice cut through the panic. It wasn't a question, it was an order. Tom looked at her, surprised, but he obeyed. Together they laid the woman in the aisle. "Cut the shirt," Vivian said, handing him the shears. She began chest compressions immediately. Staying alive, staying alive. The rhythm was automatic. "What is going on back there?" Halloway's voice barked over the intercom. "Flight attendants, secure the cabin. We are landing." "We have a dying passenger," Tom shouted into the interphone handset. "We can't strap in." "I am not diverting for a panic attack," Halloway yelled back, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "Sit down." Vivian ignored the PA. "Tom, attach the pads. Now." "But the captain! I don't care about the captain," Vivian said, pumping the woman's chest. "Do you want her to die?" Tom attached the pads. "Analyzing heart rhythm," the machine spoke. "Shock advised. Clear!" Vivian shouted. The shock was delivered. The woman's body jerked. Vivian went back to compressions. "Come on," she whispered. "Come on." 30 seconds later, the woman gasped, a ragged, desperate intake of air. "She's back," Tom sobbed. "She's back." The plane slammed onto the tarmac at JFK with a violence that suggested the pilot was angry at the ground. Vivian had managed to strap herself and the woman into the jump seat at the last second. As the plane taxied, the woman was breathing steadily, though weak. Paramedics were waiting at the gate. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holloway said, his voice dripping with irritation, "welcome to New York. Apologies for the rough landing. We had some distraction in the cabin. Local authorities will be meeting the flight to deal with the disruption." Vivian wiped the sweat from her forehead. She looked at Tom. "He thinks we were the disruption?" she asked. Tom looked angry now. "He doesn't care. He just wants to make his gate time." The plane came to a halt. The seatbelt sign turned off. "Everyone remain seated," Holloway ordered. "Security is coming on board to remove a passenger." The passengers murmured. They thought he meant the sick woman. 2 Port Authority police officers boarded the plane, followed by a man in a very expensive suit. It was Preston Davies, the chairman of the board for Ascend Airways. Holloway stepped out of the cockpit, buttoning his jacket, looking self-important. He pointed a finger toward the back of the plane. "Officers," Holloway said, "that woman in the back, row 34. She caused a scene at O'Hare, and then refused to remain seated during landing. I want her charged with interfering with a flight crew." He pointed directly at Vivian. Preston Davies looked at the captain, then looked down the aisle at Vivian, who was standing covered in sweat, her hoodie rumpled. Preston didn't look at the police. He looked at Vivian. "Dr. Toussaint?" Preston called out, his voice confused. "Are you all right?" Captain Holloway froze. He looked at Preston. You know this passenger, Mr. Chairman?" Vivian walked up the aisle. The passengers parted for her. She stopped inches from Holloway. She was shorter than him, but in that moment, she seemed 10 feet tall. "Hello, Preston," Vivian said, her voice smooth as silk. "I'm fine. Though I believe I'm being arrested." She turned her gaze to Holloway. The color was draining from the pilot's face, faster than water from a bathtub. "Dr. Toussaint?" Holloway whispered. The name was familiar. He had seen the internal memos. The new CEO, the female CEO. "Captain Holloway," Vivian said, "I believe you have my seat, 2A, and my boarding pass, the one you tore up." The silence in the cabin was absolute. Even the ambient hum of the auxiliary power unit seemed to fade into the background. Captain Brad Holloway stood at the front of the aircraft, his hand still suspended in the air where he had been pointing an accusatory finger at Vivian. His face had gone from a flushed red to a sickly, paste-like white. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out, like a goldfish dropped onto a carpet. Preston Davies, the chairman of Ascend Airways, looked from the captain to Vivian, and the pieces of the puzzle slammed together in his mind with the force of a collision. "Captain," Preston said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerous. "Did you just attempt to have Dr. Toussaint arrested for sitting in the seat you assigned her?" I didn't," Holloway stammered, his confident, booming pilot voice reduced to a squeak. He looked at the police officers. "Officers, there's been a misunderstanding. A communication error." "A misunderstanding?" Vivian stepped forward. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. The authority radiating off her was palpable. She pulled the crumpled economy boarding pass from her pocket, the one Halloway had forced Jessica to print. You told me I didn't fit the profile of a first-class passenger. You told me I was a security risk because I was wearing a hoodie. You publicly humiliated me at the gate, revoked my paid ticket. And then, when I saved a passenger's life during a medical emergency you refused to divert for, you tried to have me thrown in jail. A collective gasp ripped through the first-class cabin. Phones were recording everything. "She saved that lady's life!" Tom, the flight attendant, shouted from the galley, abandoning all protocol. "She did CPR while the captain was yelling at us to sit down." One of the Port Authority officers, a burly man who looked like he had no patience for nonsense, lowered his handcuffs. He looked at Halloway with disdain. "Captain, is this true? Did you call in a false police report on a passenger who was rendering medical aid?" "She disobeyed the seatbelt sign." Halloway grasped at straws, desperate to regain control. "Federal aviation regulations state that passengers must obey crew instructions. She was out of her seat." "To use a defibrillator," Vivian snapped. "Would you have preferred a corpse in 34E, Captain? Would that have helped your on-time arrival statistics?" Halloway stiffened. "I am the commander of this vessel. My authority is absolute." "Your authority," Vivian said, stepping closer until she was toe-to-toe with him, "is delegated. It is a privilege granted by the airline, an airline that I now run." She turned to the police officers. "Officers, I am the CIO of Ascend Airways. I will not be pressing charges against myself. However, I suggest you take a statement from the passengers regarding the captain's conduct. We will be needing it for the internal investigation." "Understood, ma'am," the officer said, tipping his cap. He turned to Halloway. "Captain, step aside. You're blocking the exit." Halloway moved, shrinking against the cockpit door. As Vivian walked past him, she didn't look at him. She looked at Preston. "Preston, have my car brought around to the tarmac, and call a meeting of the ethics committee. Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. "Of course, Vivian," Preston said, scrambling to follow her. "And the captain?" Vivian paused at the aircraft door. The cold New York air rushed in, but it was warmer than the look she cast back at the flight deck. "Captain Halloway is relieved of duty effective immediately," she said, loud enough for the entire crew to hear. "Place him on administrative leave pending the inquiry. He can find his own way home. He is not to fly on Ascend metal, not even as a passenger." She walked down the jet bridge stairs, her sneakers squeaking softly on the metal. Behind her, Halloway stood alone. The first-class passengers filed out, staring at him with open disgust. One businessman, the same one Halloway had charmed at the gate in Chicago, stopped. "You know," the man said, shaking his head. "She was right. You really don't fit the profile." The sun that rose over Manhattan the next morning was bright and unforgiving, gleaming off the steel and glass canyons of the city. But inside the corner office on the 40th floor of Ascend Airways headquarters, the atmosphere was cool, quiet, and deadly serious. Dr. Vivian Toussaint stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, her back to the room. She held a tablet in her hand, scrolling through a news feed that was moving so fast it was almost a blur. The incident at JFK had gone global. The video, shaky and filmed vertically by a passenger in row 4, was everywhere. "Hero CEO saves passenger, destroys arrogant pilot." 4 million views. Twitter was trending with "Las Ascend CEO and Saxantius fire the captain." The comments were a mixture of outrage at the pilot's behavior and stunned admiration for the woman who had performed CPR in the aisle of a turbulent 777. Vivian turned off the screen. She wasn't interested in internet fame. She wasn't interested in the stock price, which had jumped 3 points in pre-market trading due to the strong leadership narrative. She was interested in the systemic rot that had allowed yesterday to happen. She sat down at her desk, which was devoid of clutter, save for 3 thick personnel files. "Come in," she called out, answering the hesitant knock at the heavy oak door. The door opened slowly. Linda Greaves, the head of human resources, and Arthur Penhaligon, the chief of operations, stepped inside. They looked like students summoned to the principal's office after setting fire to the gym. They were seasoned executives, people who managed thousands of employees and billion-dollar budgets, but right now, they couldn't meet Vivian's eye. "Sit," Vivian commanded, gesturing to the chairs opposite her. They sat. Arthur wiped a sheen of sweat from his bald head with a handkerchief. Linda clutched her notebook as if it were a shield. "Dr. Toussaint," Arthur started, his voice tight. We've pulled Halloway's file as you requested. We stayed up all night reviewing it." "And?" Vivian asked, leaning back. Her silence was a vacuum she waited for them to fill. "It's complex," Arthur hedged. "Brad Halloway has been with Ascend for 22 years. Technically, he is one of our best. Top marks in simulator checks. Perfect fuel efficiency ratings. He can land a jumbo jet in a crosswind that would ground anyone else. From an operational standpoint, he's an ace." "I didn't ask about his stick and rudder skills, Arthur," Vivian said quietly. "I experienced his operational skills firsthand when he refused to divert for a dying woman. Tell me about his conduct." Linda cleared her throat, opening the file. Her hands were shaking slightly. "He has 64 customer complaints on file." Vivian's eyebrows shot up. The number hung in the air like a toxic cloud. 64. In an industry where 3 usually triggers a review, and he's still flying. "It's the union, Mom," Linda explained hurriedly, defensive but terrified. "Halloway was the union rep for the O'Hare hub for a decade. Every time HR tried to flag a complaint, he threatened a wildcat strike. He classified every incident as a security enforcement or a personality clash. He claimed the passengers were unruly or drunk or disrespectful of flight safety." Vivian reached out and took the file. She flipped it open. "Complaint 204. Pilot referred to a female co-pilot as stewardess repeatedly during flight. Action taken. Verbal warning. Complaint. Pilot shouted at a gate agent for allowing a family with a crying baby to board early. Action taken. None. Pilot cited crew rest disruption. Complaint. 5/10. Pilot denied boarding to a passenger because their turban looked loose and dangerous. Action taken. Passenger rebooked. Pilot commended for vigilance. Vivian closed the file with a heavy thud. It wasn't just a list of infractions, it was a roadmap of enabling. The company had chosen the path of least resistance for years, prioritizing schedule integrity over human decency. "He's a bully," Vivian said flatly. "And you let him build a fiefdom." "We didn't know the extent," Arthur began. "You knew," Vivian cut him off. "You just didn't care because the planes were landing on time. But let's look at yesterday. That wasn't just bullying. That was something else." She pulled a single sheet of paper from the file, the flight manifest from yesterday's Flight 909. "I was removed from seat 2A, Vivian said, her finger tracing the line on the paper. "Halloway claimed I didn't fit the security profile. He claimed I was a risk. So who sat in seat 2A after I was kicked to the back?" Arthur looked at his shoes. He seemed to shrink in his chair. We traced the ticket update." "Say it," Vivian ordered. "He gave the upgrade to a non-revenue passenger," Arthur whispered. "A buddy pass rider." "A buddy pass," Vivian repeated, her voice turning to ice. "Who was it?" "His nephew," Linda said softly. "Kyle Halloway, a college student. He was stuck on the standby list for economy. The flight was full." Vivian sat back, the pieces locking together. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. "So," Vivian said, analyzing the data aloud. Captain Halloway didn't see a security threat. He saw a seat he wanted. He realized the flight was full, saw a woman in a hoodie he assumed was powerless, and fabricated a federal security risk to kick a paying, full-fare customer off the plane, just so he could give a free first-class seat to his nephew. "It appears so," Arthur admitted. "He marked you as denied boarding, non-compliant in the system to justify the open seat." "That is theft," Vivian said. "He stole $2,000 of revenue from this company, and worse, he filed a false report with the TSA to cover his tracks. That is a federal crime." She looked at her executives. They looked sick. They realized that this was no longer an HR issue. This was a criminal liability that could ground the airline if they didn't handle it perfectly. "I want the witnesses," Vivian said, shifting gears. "Are they here?" "Yes," Linda nodded. "Jessica, the gate agent, and Tom, the flight attendant. We flew them in this morning. They're in the waiting room." "Send them in." A moment later, the door opened. Jessica and Tom walked in. They looked exhausted. Jessica's eyes were red-rimmed, likely from crying. Tom was walking with a noticeable limp, favoring his left leg, the result of being thrown around the cabin during the turbulence yesterday. They wore their uniforms, but they looked like soldiers returning from a lost battle. When they saw Vivian, they stiffened. To them, the CEO's office was where careers went to die. "Dr. Toussaint," Jessica said, her voice trembling so hard it was barely audible. I am so sorry. I should have stopped him. I should have called a supervisor. I tried to tell him the scanner was working," she added, tears spilling over, "but he took the pass." Vivian stood up. She walked around the massive desk. She didn't stop until she was standing right in front of them. "Jessica," Vivian said softly. The young woman flinched, expecting to be fired. "Look at me." Jessica looked up. "You were being bullied by a superior who has a history of intimidation spanning 20 years, Vivian said firmly. "You tried to warn me with your eyes. You apologized when he wasn't looking. You are not the problem." She turned to Tom. "And you. You defied a direct order from the cockpit to help me save a life. You prioritized the passenger over the protocol. You got hurt doing it." Tom swallowed hard. "I thought I was going to be fired, Ma'am. The captain, he said he'd have my badge." "Captain Halloway doesn't own your badge," Vivian said. "Ascend Airways does, and Ascend Airways values courage." She placed a hand on Tom's shoulder. "How is your leg?" It's fine, Ma'am. Just a bruise." "Take a week off, with pay. Both of you," Vivian ordered. She looked back at Linda. "Make it happen, and put a commendation in their files. These are the people I want running this airline, not the cowboys in the cockpit." Tom and Jessica looked at each other, stunned. The relief in the room was palpable, like a pressure valve being released. "Thank you. Thank you so much," Jessica whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Vivian said, her eyes hardening as she looked back at Arthur and Linda. "We have one more thing to do." She walked back to her desk and pressed the intercom button. "Susan?" "Yes, Dr. Toussaint?" Her assistant's voice chirped. "Schedule a formal tribunal. Boardroom A. 1 hour," Vivian said. "Summon Captain Halloway and tell him to bring his union representative. We are doing this by the book." Arthur stood up, looking nervous. "Dr. Toussaint, if we call a tribunal, the union will bring their lawyers. They will fight dirty. Halloway will deny everything about the nephew. He'll say it was a coincidence." Vivian smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Let him deny it," Vivian said. Let him lie on the record. Because while you were reading his file, I had IT pull the surveillance tapes from gate K12. She tapped the tablet on her desk. I have the video, Vivian said, and I have the audio. I have him confessing the plan to Jessica before I even walked up to the podium. She looked at Arthur. He thinks he's walking into a negotiation, Vivian said. He's walking into an execution. The boardroom on the 40th floor of the Ascend Airways headquarters was usually a place of dry financial forecasts and strategic planning. Today, however, it felt less like a corporate meeting room and more like a courtroom awaiting a capital verdict. Outside, the New York sky was a flat, oppressive grey, the clouds hanging low over the skyscrapers. Inside, the air conditioning hummed with a low, menacing vibration that seemed to amplify the silence. Dr. Vivian Toussaint sat at the head of the massive mahogany table. She was perfectly still, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, resting on a single thin manila folder. To her right sat Preston Davies, the chairman, who looked grim. To her left sat the company's general counsel, a woman with eyes like flint. The heavy double doors opened. Captain Brad Halloway entered. For the first time in 20 years, he wasn't wearing his uniform. Without the epaulets, the gold wings, and the double-breasted jacket, he looked diminished. He wore a grey suit that seemed slightly too large for him, perhaps because his usual confident posture had collapsed into a defensive slouch. Beside him walked Gary O'Malley, the union representative. O'Malley was a bulldog of a man, known for dragging out negotiations and protecting his pilots with fierce, often abrasive loyalty. He carried a thick briefcase and wore the expression of a man prepared to fight a war of attrition. "Please sit," Vivian said. Her voice was neither warm nor hostile. It was indifferent. Halloway took the seat at the far end of the table. He refused to make eye contact with Vivian, focusing instead on the water pitcher in the center of the table. O'Malley sat next to him, immediately opening his briefcase and spreading out a series of documents. "Let's make this quick," O'Malley started, his tone brisk and businesslike. He leaned forward, trying to seize control of the narrative before the meeting officially began. "We've reviewed the passenger complaints from yesterday. Captain Halloway admits to a lapse in judgment regarding the customer service aspect. He didn't recognize the CEO, an honest mistake that could happen to anyone." O'Malley paused, looking around the room to gauge the reaction. Seeing only stone-faced silence, he pressed on. "However, we need to separate rude behavior from operational authority. The captain has the final say on who boards his aircraft. If he felt there was a security concern, he acted within his rights. We are willing to accept a 2-week suspension without pay and a written letter of apology to Dr. Toussaint. But," O'Malley's voice hardened, "if you try to terminate a senior captain for upholding security protocols, the union will file a grievance. We will frame this as management compromising safety for VIP treatment. We will ground your fleet for a week." It was a standard union play. Admit to the minor offense to protect against the major one, then threaten total war if the company pushed back. Halloway seemed to gain strength from O'Malley's words. He finally looked up, crossing his arms over his chest. The arrogance that had defined him at the gate began to creep back into his eyes. "I was protecting the flight deck," Halloway stated, his voice regaining some of its deep, booming timbre. "You were acting suspicious, Dr. Toussaint. You were wearing a hoodie, you had no luggage, and you were loitering near the priority lane. In my experience, that fits the profile of a drug mule or a security threat. I stand by my assessment." Vivian listened without blinking. She let the silence stretch out after he finished, letting his words hang in the air until they began to sound desperate rather than confident. "Profile," Vivian said softly, testing the word. "Let's talk about that word," Captain." She didn't open her folder. Instead, she picked up a small remote control from the table and pointed it at the 80-inch monitor mounted on the wall behind her. "You claim your decision was based on a security assessment, a professional evaluation of a potential threat," Vivian noted. "But modern airports are very interesting places, Captain. They are ecosystems of data. Every keystroke, every movement, and every sound is logged." The screen flickered to life. It wasn't the viral video from the plane filmed by passengers. This was high-definition CCTV footage from Gate K-12 in Chicago. The timestamp read 05:30 a.m. On the screen, the image was crisp. Halloway was leaning against the back wall of the podium, holding his coffee cup. He looked relaxed, bored even. He was chatting with Jessica, the gate agent. He was laughing, a belly laugh that shook his shoulders. "We pulled the tapes," Vivian said, her voice dropping to a register that commanded absolute attention. "And we pulled the audio from the gate microphone." Halloway shifted in his seat. This is irrelevant. It just shows me at work." "Listen," Vivian commanded. She pressed a button. The audio, enhanced and crystal clear, filled the boardroom. Halloway, recording. "Yeah, my nephew is stuck in standby. The flight's oversold in economy. I promised his mum I'd get him to New York for the weekend." Jessica, recording. "We're full up front too, Captain. First class is checked in full." Halloway, recording. "Let me see. Seat 2A is open? No, wait. Some nobody named Coate booked it. Full fare. Ouch." Jessica, recording. "Captain, we can't move a full fare. That's a revenue ticket." On the screen, Halloway's face twisted into a smirk. Halloway, recording. "Watch me. I'll just say she looked sketchy. Find a reason. Bump her. The kid needs a seat." Vivian paused the video. The freeze frame caught Halloway in that exact moment of smug satisfaction. The silence in the boardroom was now heavier than lead. It was suffocating. Gary O'Malley slowly took his hands off the table. He stared at the screen, his mouth slightly open. He looked at the timestamp, then at the transcript in his mind. He turned his head slowly to look at Halloway. The look on the union rep's face wasn't support. It was shock, and then it was fury. Halloway's face had drained of all color. He looked like a corpse propped up in a chair. He opened his mouth to speak, but his throat clicked dryly. "That's," Halloway croaked, his voice cracking. "That's taken out of context." "The context," Vivian said, her voice slicing through the air like a scalpel, "is fraud. Federal fraud." She stood up. The chair scraped against the floor, a harsh sound that made Halloway flinch. She began to walk slowly down the length of the long table. "You didn't suspect a security threat, Captain. You fabricated a federal security event to facilitate theft of services," Vivian explained, her pace measured. "You profiled me, yes, but you didn't profile me as a terrorist. You profiled me as someone who wouldn't fight back. You assumed a black woman in a hoodie wouldn't have the resources, the knowledge, or the power to challenge a senior captain." She stopped directly behind Halloway's chair. He could feel her presence looming over him. "And then," she continued, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed rage, "when I was saving a woman's life, a woman whose heart had stopped, you prioritized your ego over her survival. You refused to divert. You threatened to arrest the person administering CPR." Vivian looked at the union representative. "Mr. O'Malley," she said, "does the pilots' union defend fraud? Does it defend falsifying Department of Homeland Security reports to give free upgrades to family members? Does it defend gross negligence resulting in near death?" Gary O'Malley closed his folder with a snap. It sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. He stood up. He didn't look at Halloway. He looked at Vivian, and he nodded once, a gesture of respect and concession. "The union withdraws its counsel," O'Malley said flatly. "Gary?" Holloway gasped, turning to grab the man's sleeve. "Gary, wait. You can't leave me here. We can negotiate a deal." O'Malley pulled his arm away, as if Holloway were contagious. "There's no deal for this, Brad. You lied to me. You lied to the company. You're on your own." O'Malley walked to the door and exited without looking back. Holloway was alone. The silence that followed was total. He looked up at Vivian, and the last vestiges of the confident captain evaporated. His shoulders slumped, his face crumbled. He wasn't a powerful aviator anymore. He was a middle-aged man realizing his life was over. "Dr. Toussaint," he pleaded, his voice shaking. "Please, I have a mortgage. I have 2 kids in college. I don't know how to do anything else. Flying is all I know." Tears began to well in his eyes. "I'll take a demotion. I'll go back to the right seat. I'll fly cargo. Please, don't take my wings." Vivian looked down at him. She didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel the thrill of revenge. She felt a profound, aching pity. It was the pity one feels for a structure that looks strong on the outside, but is rotten to the core. "You said I didn't fit the profile, Captain," she said, echoing the words he had sneered at her only 24 hours ago. "And you were right. I don't fit the profile of a victim." She slid the manila folder across the mahogany table. It stopped inches from his trembling hands. "This is your termination notice. For cause. Effective immediately," Vivian stated. "But that is the least of your problems." Holloway stared at the folder, afraid to touch it. "We are legally obligated to forward the evidence of your security report falsification to the FAA and the Department of Homeland Security," Vivian added, her voice final. "You won't be flying cargo, Mr. Holloway. You will likely never pilot an aircraft again." Holloway put his head in his hands. A sob escaped him. Vivian turned and walked back to her chair at the head of the table. She didn't sit down. She simply pointed to the door. "Get out of my building." 6 months later, the atmosphere at Chicago O'Hare International Airport was unrecognizable. The biting, gray chill of the winter blizzard had been replaced by the shimmering, humid heat of mid-July. But the change in temperature outside was nothing compared to the thaw that had occurred inside the terminals of Ascend Airways. Dr. Vivian Toussaint walked through the concourse, the rhythmic click of her heels on the terrazzo floor blending with the hum of the busy airport. Today, she wasn't wearing a hoodie to blend in. She wore a tailored navy suit that commanded respect, yet her demeanor remained approachable. She didn't march with a phalanx of security. She walked alone, carrying her own bag, stopping occasionally to nod at a janitor or shake hands with a gate agent. The data on her tablet told a story of financial resurrection. Ascend stock was up 15%. On-time departures had hit a 5-year high. But Vivian measured success by a different metric. She listened to the laughter at the check-in counters. She saw crew members walking with their heads high, not hunched in anticipation of a reprimand. The culture of fear that had allowed men like Brad Holloway to rule like petty tyrants had been dismantled, replaced by a system where accountability flowed both ways. She approached Gate K-12, the same gate where she had once been humiliated. The podium was no longer a fortress of stress. Standing behind it was Jessica. The young woman who had once trembled while typing a boarding pass was now wearing a blazer with a silver pin on the lapel. Station manager. She was currently speaking to a new hire, her voice calm, authoritative, and kind. "Remember," Jessica was saying, pointing to the screen. "If the system flags a passenger, you verify with a smile. We don't police our customers. We protect them." "There's a difference." Vivian smiled. The cycle of abuse had been broken. "Good morning, Dr. Toussaint." Jessica beamed as she looked up, her anxiety replaced by professional pride. "Morning, Jessica," Vivian replied, leaning against the counter. "How is the turnaround for Flight 909? "Perfect. We're fully boarded 10 minutes early. No drama, no bumps, just business," Jessica reported. "It's amazing how much smoother things run when the flight deck isn't fighting the ground crew." "Keep up the good work," Vivian said softly. While Jessica finalized the paperwork, Vivian drifted toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The sun was beating down on the concrete apron, creating waves of heat distortion that made the distant aircraft look like mirages. The glamour of aviation often hid the brutal reality of the tarmac, the noise, the jet fumes, and the searing heat. Her eyes tracked the movement of the ground support vehicles. Fuel trucks, catering vans, and baggage carts wove a complex dance around the jets. A baggage train for a budget charter airline, known for its rock-bottom fares and grueling schedules, rattled past the window. It was towing a heavy load of luggage toward a waiting Airbus. The driver of the cart was wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of a grime-streaked glove. He wore a neon yellow safety vest over a stained t-shirt, and heavy ear defenders clamped over his head. His posture was slumped, the body language of a man who spent his days lifting 50-pound bags in 100-degree heat. He turned the steering wheel, maneuvering the cart near the ascend plane. As he did, he looked up at the terminal window. Vivian froze. Beneath the layer of grit, the sunburn and the exhaustion, the face was unmistakable. The silver-streaked hair, once the crown of a distinguished captain, was now matted with sweat. It was Brad Halloway. The fall had been absolute. Following the internal investigation, the FAA had taken a keen interest in his habit of falsifying security reports. They didn't take kindly to pilots who weaponized federal regulations for personal gain. His commercial transport certificate had been revoked. The prestigious pension, the seniority, the six-figure salary, the power to command the sky, it was all gone. Now, he was part of the machinery he used to disdain. He was the ground support. He was the invisible man. For a long, suspended moment, their gazes locked through the thick, reinforced glass. There was no arrogance left in Halloway's eyes. There was no sneer, no condescending wink. There was only the hollow, haunted look of a man who realized, too late, that he was never the god he thought he was. He looked at Vivian, standing in the air-conditioned terminal, the undisputed leader of the airline he used to work for, and he swallowed hard. The shame was palpable. It radiated off him stronger than the heat from the tarmac. Halloway broke eye contact first. He couldn't bear it. He bowed his head, shifted the baggage cart into gear, and drove away, disappearing into the exhaust fumes of a jet engine. Just another anonymous worker in a neon vest. Vivian watched him go. She didn't feel a surge of vindictive triumph. She felt a quiet, heavy sense of balance. The universe had corrected itself. "Ready to go, boss?" Vivian turned. Tom, now the chief purser for the Chicago base, was standing at the entrance to the jet bridge. He looked sharp, happy, and ready to fly. Vivian looked back at the empty tarmac where the cart had been, then turned her back on the window. "Ready," Vivian said. She picked up her bag. She didn't need a hoodie to prove she was humble, and she didn't need 4 stripes on her shoulder to prove she was powerful. She just needed to lead. And as she walked down the jet bridge, Dr. Vivian Toussaint knew that Ascend Airways was finally, truly, rising. And that is how Captain Brad Halloway learned that the most important instrument in the cockpit isn't the altimeter. It's humility. He judged a book by its cover, and that book turned out to be the one that wrote his pink slip. It's a powerful reminder that in life, and especially in business, You never truly know who you are talking to. Treat the janitor with the same respect as the CEO, because one day, that nobody might be the one holding the keys to your future. If you enjoyed this story of instant karma and justice, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. What would you have done if you were Vivian? Let me know in the comments below.